In 2003, there was a game called XIII, XIII, and it was brought to us by Ubisoft Paris. Running on the mighty Unreal Engine 2, it was a bit of a marvel in terms of its visual style and flair, and it's garnered a bit of a cult following. Then came its 2020 relaunch though, and all of that hard work was undone. It had lots of bugs, the presentation wasn't great, and it put quite a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. The remake promised several improvements, including a refined art style, enhanced AI, a reworked HUD, revamped sound design, 30 FPS frame rate on Switch, 60 on other consoles, and online multiplayer for 2 to 13 players. Does it live up to that on the Nintendo Switch? Or am I about to give you 13 reasons you should avoid it? Well, let's find out. We'll start then with the visuals, performance and audio, because that's probably the part that most of you are interested in. Now, in the pre-release material, we were promised 30 frames per second. Is that what we've got? In a word, no, it's not what we've got. In the earlier levels, the game is struggling to maintain 25 or 26 frames per second when you're outdoors. This seems to be a theme across the experience. Anytime you're in a larger open area, it really does struggle to keep that frame rate. This is unfortunate. As we all know with shooters, frame rate's very important in terms of aiming. They also seem to have opted for an uncapped frame rate. There are times when it can go above 30 quite considerably. Now, this is all featured using the day one patch, and you'll see from the footage there are some areas that fare much better than others. When we look at the multiplayer, you've got several different options here. You can play solo, split screen with 2 of you, 3 and even 4 player split screen. There is an online, but we'll talk about that when we're not in the performance section. Now, performance in multiplayer, it's affected by the split screen, but in terms of frame rate consistency, it actually fares far better. The most notable hit is obviously when you're splitting that screen 4 ways, but a drop in that overall image quality is a sensible choice to keep things ticking over. Ironically, we've got GoldenEye coming with its 4-player split screen, and as far as frame rates, this is higher than that was, and that was absolutely fine. In handheld mode, we're looking at very much the same story. Some areas good and some not so good. The sound has certainly seen some improvements. The overall fidelity is better, however there are some slightly unusual mixes. A good example of this is when you're in the snowy mountains. The audio levels don't sound quite right, some are too high and some are too low, but still, comparative to the 2020 release, it's much better overall. And that takes us on to the image quality. Now, the models they used for the original, well not the original, but the 2020 remake, were absolutely appalling. It's certainly a more appealing modernisation that still uses some of that cel-shaded style. Unfortunately, the quality of the Switch models, not quite that good. We're seeing quite a lot of aliasing, the jaggy edges on the outsides of objects, but even with this, it's still superior to that 2020 release. With the original release being a bit of an embarrassment for Microids, they actually got an entirely new developer to work on this one, and they had a bit of a monumental task on their hands, honestly, especially releasing across so many different platforms. As it stands then, performance on Nintendo Switch isn't quite where I'd like it to be. This is partly down to maintaining a reasonably high resolution, but it seems like, as we've seen many times before, the Switch just struggles, particularly when pushed to the limits of its hardware. Now, I've no doubt this can be improved on what we see at the moment, but at least the core things are in place. The image quality is much better than it was, the frame rate is maintained when indoors, but the drops and spikes and climbs above 30 don't help the experience. For me, visuals and performance currently score 13 out of 20, and the audio scores 16 out of 20.
Listen, Mongoose has found you. Meet me on the roof.
I'm going to assume you've never played the XIII original game as well as the remake, and treat this like a brand new title. You follow the story of the titular 13. After being shot in the chest on a mission, he's dropped into the thick of the action, and will have to recover his memory while trying to stay alive and figure out exactly why everyone wants him dead. It's classic 90s action film, replete with cheesy dialogue and villains straight out of a Bond movie. It's really good to see that the developer have worked hard to make the Switch version at least feel like a separate edition. Here you'll find options for gyroscopic controls. You can have the aim down the sights or the always on options. ADS is nice because it lets you tweak the actual sensitivities of the gyro, Initially, for my first couple of hours, it was way too sensitive, but I found that if you drop this to 0.5, it's a much nicer experience. I'm not someone that uses gyro all the time, I just use it for that precision aiming, and in that regard it works quite well. It will be hindered when the performance drops though. If they can get that frame rate to stick, then we'll be fine, but when there's lots of enemies on the screen, aiming can become, well, like this. You're rewarded for headshots, and there will be options to go the stealthy route. There are a number of different weapons, all accessible through a radial menu, and aiming for the head will always be the order of the day. A few of the missions that were always bad still feel pretty bad, and moving from chair to chair, taking out the different guards felt entirely ludicrous. You can grab guards from behind and use them as human shields. As long as your back's away from the enemy, then they won't take a shot. But as soon as they see an opening, well, it's a different story. This is definitely an improvement over the 2020 release. Stealth is facilitated by the on-screen onomatopoeic words of footsteps, and this enables you to see when exactly to kaplonk them with that chair. It works out sometimes, and at others it's a complete flail fest. You have a melee attack, but it looks decidedly last gen, and in keeping with its origins, there are health pack pickups, as well as secret items hidden around each stage. 13 doesn't require you to think much. The occasional distractions like crawling through a vent or using your grappling hook to swing onto a ledge mix things up a little, but generally it'll be enter a space, either stealthily or overt, face down your enemy, which seems to work out quite poorly for them. Each weapon has its own recoil, and you are encouraged to go for the headshots and burst fire for more accuracy. Other than that, you can dash in any direction by clicking in the left stick, and you've your handy crouch. For better and sometimes worse, it feels like an early 2000s shooter, picking locks by shoving the lockpicks in the centre of the door, trying to be stealthy while alerting everyone, and sniping enemies with the shakiest hands available. Now, the multiplayer options allow you to play either locally by splitting the screen up to 4 times, and you've got deathmatch or team deathmatch. The online mode, unfortunately, I haven't been able to try because I couldn't find anyone online. It seems to be standard issue on Switch, especially around the very beginning of launch for this to happen. So we'll have to focus on that local multiplayer, and I've had a blast. There aren't many in my house who can play these types of games, as you can probably tell from the footage, but the instant we all got round the screen, there's that classic feeling, the same one you had when you played GoldenEye. It's just a whole lot of fun. And I guess that's where I fall really with 13 in general. It's not an amazing shooter. The design is dated in so many ways, but it's still fun to play. I'm really pleased they've included multiplayer for the Switch version, specifically that local play, and if that's something you're interested in, well, it's probably the best aspect of the game. Performance negatively impacted my single player experience at times, but it is nice to see a few of the improvements, if not quite the groundbreaking change that many were hoping for. Overall, I would give gameplay 14 out of 20. They've done everything they can with the controls, but those are negatively impacted when the performance drops down. Control score 15 out of 20. 13 will set you back £34.99 or your regional equivalent on the eShop, but there's a physical which can already be had for £30 at shop2.net here in the UK, and it will be likely to be found cheaply in other countries as well. As far as value goes, well, I am impressed with what Microids have done in terms of dedication to improving what was really a terrible release back in 2020. It's a shame that the Switch version doesn't meet their stated 30 frames per second, and while it remains to be seen how the online performs, the split screen is a lot of fun. With that said though, I think lots of people are going to be stretched to pay £35, with around 20 to 25 being the sweet spot. Value scores 14 out of 20. Had 13 run at the promised 30 frames per second locked out, then we'd be looking at a higher score, and you have to respect a publisher that goes out of their way to employ a brand new developer to improve the experience. And while in its mechanics it's going to show its age regardless, there's still some fun to be had here. It gets a SwitchUp score of 72%. Do keep your eye out for our Bear and Breakfast review, which is coming hopefully tomorrow. I am in love with that game. It could be like my next Stardew Valley, and I don't say that lightly, like it is just, chef's kiss. But thanks to the publisher for the review copy here, thanks to all of you that enjoy the channel and to our brand new Patreons, and as always, if you want to save 10% on any of these games, just use code SwitchUp over at switchup.gg to buy your eShop credit. For all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys, see ya!